Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine or have a sense that something isn't quite right? In this channel, we dive deep into the realm of the mysterious and the unknown. From chilling encounters with cryptids to baffling events that defy logic, we explore the stories that will make you completely question your own reality. So settle in, buckle up, and get yourself cozy, because the journey into the unknown begins now. Officer Greg Morrison glanced at the dashboard clock of his patrol car. It was nearing midnight, and the quiet of the night had settled over the suburban streets of Henderson, Nevada. The city, located just outside of Las Vegas, had its fair share of crime, but this part of town was usually calm at this hour. His partner, Officer Rick Gomez, was sipping from a cup of lukewarm coffee, eyes scanning the darkened streets for any signs of trouble. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Unit 6-8, we have a report of a disturbance at Sloan Canyon. Multiple callers report loud noises and a possible fight in progress. No further details at this time. Greg raised an eyebrow and exchanged a glance with Rick. Sloan Canyon wasn't the typical spot for a fight. It was a nature preserve, popular with hikers during the day, but it closed after dusk. The place had rugged terrain, and it was hard to imagine anyone being there this late at night, let alone engaging in a brawl. "Sounds like a bunch of kids causing trouble," Rick said, setting his coffee in the cup holder. "Yeah, probably," Greg replied, pulling the car into a U-turn to head toward the canyon. "Let's check it out." The drive out to Sloan Canyon was quiet. The lights of the city faded behind them as they headed south, and soon the open desert surrounded them on both sides. The entrance to the canyon wasn't much, just a small parking lot and a dirt trail that led up into the rocky hills. Greg pulled the car into the lot, noticing the absence of any other vehicles. "Doesn't look like anyone's here," Rick said, scanning the area. Greg cut the engine and radioed in their location. Unit 6-8 on scene at Sloan Canyon, no vehicles present, proceeding on foot. The two officers stepped out of the car, the desert air cool and still. The moon was high, casting a bit of light over the rugged landscape. From where they stood, the trail leading into the canyon was just visible, snaking its way through jagged rocks and sparse brush. As they walked, the silence of the night felt strange. The only sounds were their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Then, faintly at first, they heard it. Distant noises like shouting and the unmistakable sound of something heavy slamming into rock. It was coming from deeper within the canyon. "Sounds like a real fight," Greg muttered, picking up the pace. Rick nodded, reaching for his flashlight. "Let's hope it's just a couple of hikers who had too much to drink." The noises grew louder as they approached, echoing off the canyon walls. The two officers reached a point where the trail dipped down into a narrow ravine. Up ahead, the moonlight illuminated the source of the commotion. Greg stopped in his tracks, narrowing his eyes. At first glance, it looked like two large figures were grappling with each other near a rock formation, but something about them was off. They moved in a way that didn't seem entirely human, too fast, too fluid. As they got closer, Greg realized why. The creatures, whatever they were massive, easily standing over 7 feet tall. Their skin was a dark, leathery texture, and their limbs were elongated, with fingers that ended in sharp, claw-like tips. Their faces were a grotesque mix of animal and human features, with glowing yellow eyes that reflected the moonlight. "What the hell?" Rick whispered, his voice barely audible. Greg felt his stomach drop. These things weren't human. They were fighting viciously, claws tearing at each other, snarling and growling in a language neither officer recognized. One of the creatures slammed the other into a boulder with a sickening thud, sending rocks scattering. Jake's first instinct was to put his hand on his holster, but his mind raced. What were they even dealing with? He had never seen anything like this. He motioned for Rick to stay back, but Rick was already frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. The fight between the creatures raged on, their movements almost too fast to follow. One of them lunged forward, its claws slicing through the air. The other ducked and retaliated, grabbing its opponent by the throat and slamming it into the ground with enough force to send a shockwave through the ground. Dust kicked up around them, and the sound of cracking rock echoed through the canyon. Greg felt the adrenaline surging through him, but he knew they were outmatched. Nothing could stop whatever these things were. The realization that they were way out of their depth hit him hard. "We need to call this in," he whispered to Rick, keeping his voice low. Rick nodded, but his hand was shaking as he reached for his radio. He clicked it on, but before he could say anything, one of the creatures turned its head toward them. Its glowing eyes locked onto the two officers, and it let out a low, guttural growl. "Retreat now," Greg ordered, pulling Rick by the arm. The creature took a step toward them, its claws flexing. The other creature, still on the ground, snarled and kicked at its opponent, distracting it for a brief moment. That was all the time Greg and Rick needed to retreat. They backed up slowly, never taking their eyes off the creatures, who were still locked in their violent struggle. The officers didn't stop moving until they reached the edge of the ravine, where they ducked behind a large boulder for cover. Greg grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 68. We have a situation at Sloan Canyon. Repeat, a situation. Requesting immediate backup." The radio crackled and dispatch responded. "Unit 68, please clarify. What is the nature of the situation?" Greg hesitated, unsure of how to even explain what they had just seen. "Dispatch, we've got two hostile entities, not human. I repeat, not human. We need backup immediately." There was a long pause on the other end before dispatch responded. "Copy that, Unit 68, backup en route, ETA 10 minutes. Greg shoved the radio back onto his belt. 10 minutes. It felt like an eternity. He glanced over at Rick, who was still wide-eyed, gripping his flashlight like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "We just need to keep our distance," Greg said, trying to sound calm. "We can't do anything without backup." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure what backup could do against creatures like these. They were still fighting, their growls and snarls filling the canyon. One of them managed to get the upper hand, pinning the other against a rock. It let out a roar that echoed through the night. The officers crouched behind the boulder, waiting, listening to the sound of the fight as it continued. Every minute felt like an hour, but finally, they heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. Backup arrived just as the fight seemed to reach its peak. More patrol cars pulled into the parking lot. The creatures, now aware of the new presence, disengaged from their fight. They stood still for a moment, looking around as if assessing the situation. Then, without warning, they both bolted, darting up the canyon walls with unnatural speed, disappearing into the rocky terrain before anyone could react. Greg and Rick stood up slowly, exchanging a glance. "What the hell just happened?" Rick asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Greg replied, still trying to process everything. Sergeant Daniels, a veteran of the Henderson Police Department, was the first to approach them. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a reputation for keeping his cool in high-pressure situations. His eyes were sharp, already assessing the scene as he walked up. "Morrison, Gomez," Daniels greeted, his voice steady but questioning. "What the hell are we dealing with out here?" Greg exchanged a glance with Rick, who was still pale, clutching his flashlight like it was a lifeline. Neither of them had any real answers. Greg cleared his throat. "I don't know how to explain this, Sarge. We thought we were responding to a simple fight, but when we got here," he trailed off, unsure of how to put it into words. "They weren't human." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" not human. They were huge, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, dark, leathery skin, claws like... I don't even know what to compare them to, Greg said, frustration creeping into his voice. They were fighting, tearing each other apart, fast, strong, way beyond anything I've ever seen. Rick, still shaken, nodded in agreement. They looked like monsters, Sarge, and they knew we were here. One of them looked right at us, but then they took off when they heard the backup coming. Daniels was silent for a moment. "All right," Daniels finally said. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe it was something with a logical explanation, like weirdos fighting in the canyon. We'll search the area, see if we can track them down. We're not leaving until we get some answers." Greg wanted to protest, to insist that what they saw wasn't anything as simple as a couple of whacked-out people in costumes. But he held his tongue. There was no point in arguing until they had more evidence. Sergeant Daniels turned to the other officers. "Split into teams and search the area. I want every rock and crevice checked. Report anything unusual, and be careful. Whatever we're dealing with, it's dangerous." The officers nodded, spreading out into the canyon with flashlights in hand. Greg and Rick remained with Daniels, the three of them heading deeper into the canyon where the creatures had disappeared. As they moved farther from the parking lot, the noise from the other officers began to fade. The canyon felt eerily quiet again, as if the creatures had taken all the sound with them when they fled. The moonlight cast long shadows across the rocks, and every rustle of the wind through the sparse desert brush set Greg on edge. Rick broke the silence after a while. "You think they're still watching us?" Greg hadn't considered that, but now that Rick had said it, the thought lingered. It wouldn't be hard for the creatures to be observing them from the cliffs above, hidden by the darkness. Jake's hand instinctively went to his holster, though deep down he wasn't sure how much good it would do if they encountered the creatures again. Daniels stayed focused, shining his flashlight up along the rocky ledges. "Let's just keep moving. If they're out there, we'll find them." The three officers carefully navigated the uneven ground, stepping over rocks and loose gravel as they went deeper into the canyon. The sounds of the other officers had all but disappeared now, leaving just the crunch of their own footsteps and the occasional howl of wind. Then, up ahead, Greg noticed something unusual. At the base of a large boulder, there was a strange marking, a deep gouge in the rock, like something had torn into it with claws. He crouched down to inspect it more closely, shining his flashlight on the jagged lines. "Sergeant, take a look at this," Greg called out. Daniels and Rick joined him, both frowning at the marks. "That's no animal," Daniels muttered. "No bear or mountain lion did this." Greg nodded. "These could match the claws those creatures had." Rick exhaled slowly. "So, it looks like they've been through here recently." Daniels stood up, scanning the area. "Keep your eyes open. They could still be close." As they continued moving, the canyon walls began to close in, the path narrowing. The flashlight beams bounced off the uneven surfaces, casting eerie shadows. Every so often, they would find another sign, more claw marks, or small piles of rocks that looked disturbed, as if something large had passed through in a hurry. After about half an hour, they reached a small clearing where the canyon opened up again. It was here that they found something that made all three of them stop in their tracks. In the middle of the clearing was a patch of ground that had been scorched black. The surrounding rocks were charred, and the air smelled faintly of something burning, like sulfur. At the center of the blackened ground was a strange, twisted piece of metal, almost like a fragment of something larger, but unidentifiable. "What the hell is this?" Rick asked, crouching down to get a closer look. Daniels didn't answer right away, his expression darkening. "Whatever it is, it's completely screwed up." Greg took a step closer, his flashlight focused on the twisted metal. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. alien almost. The edges were sharp and jagged, and the surface had a strange, iridescent sheen to it, reflecting the flashlight in odd ways. Rick reached out as if to touch it, but Daniels grabbed his arm. "Don't. We don't know what that is." Rick nodded, backing away. Greg scanned the area again, his heart pounding. Between the creatures, the claw marks, and now this, it was becoming clear that they were dealing with something far beyond their usual experience. Suddenly, there was a loud noise from above, a scraping, like something heavy moving across the rocks. All three officers looked up, shining their flashlights toward the source of the sound. For a split second, Greg thought he saw something, a shadowy figure darting between the rocks, too fast to get a clear look. "Did you see that?" Greg whispered, his heart racing. Daniels nodded grimly. "We're not alone out here. Stay sharp." They continued their search, but after another hour of combing the area, there was no further sign of the creatures. Eventually, Daniels called off the search. Silently, all three of the men felt a mixed sense of relief and failure. As they headed back to the parking lot, Greg was sure that something was still watching them. Whatever those creatures were, they were still alert. Back at the precinct, Greg and Rick filed their report, but they both knew the official record wouldn't come close to explaining what had really happened. The creatures, the strange markings, the metal fragment. It was all too strange, too impossible, completely impossible. And he was right. The official version of events would describe it as an unexplained disturbance involving possible unknown individuals. But that didn't even scratch the surface of what they had encountered. When they heard it, Rick was sitting across from Greg, leaning back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Neither of them had said much more about it. Sergeant Daniels had gone to debrief with the higher-ups, but Greg had no idea how that conversation was going to go. How could anyone make sense of what they saw? Greg rubbed his temples, trying to push away the headache forming at the base of his skull. His mind kept replaying the same images, the creatures tearing into each other, the gouges in the rock, and that twisted piece of metal in the clearing. There was something bigger at play here, but what could they do? Rick finally broke the silence. "You think they'll come back?" Greg glanced over at him. "I don't know, but whatever those things were, they didn't seem like the kind that just disappear." Rick nodded slowly, as if trying to accept that answer. "And what about that metal? You think the department's going to figure out what that is?" Greg shook his head. "Doubt it. That's not something we have the tools to explain." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the low hum of the precinct's HVAC system the only sound in the room. The tension hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was as if they were both waiting for something, some sign, some clue that would make sense of it all. But nothing came. Finally, Greg stood up, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. "I think we've done all we can for tonight." Rick looked up at him. "Yeah, not much else we can do now." They both knew the unease wouldn't disappear overnight, but they also knew there was no immediate answer waiting for them. There was no explanation they could hang on to. The truth, whatever it was, had slipped through their fingers the moment those creatures disappeared into the canyon. As Greg walked toward the door, he stopped and turned to Rick. "Keep your phone close. If anything else comes up, we'll be the first to know." Rick gave a tired nod. "You too, man." And that's how it ended. Officers Rick and Greg were never told anything further about the situation in the canyon. They asked about it for weeks, but were always told that the file had been closed and deemed no longer relevant. Of course, they both knew that this was just the department's way of keeping them out of it, and so eventually they moved on from hoping to ever learn what happened. They both struggle with never finding the truth. It's part of the reason they are hoping we can help. Do any of you have any insights? Anything that can help to give them closure?